It is 5:30 in the morning. A wind-up alarm clock, Soviet-made, probably a Rakita, begins to rattle on a bedside table in a concrete apartment on the 8th floor of a housing block in Budapest. The block is one of thousands. It was built from prefabricated panels, enormous slabs of reinforced concrete lifted into place by crane, bolted together and called home. Welcome to the panelház. By the 1970s, millions of Hungarians lived in apartments like this one. 2 rooms, perhaps 40 square meters, a married couple, 2 children, and, more often than you might expect, a grandparent, all sharing walls thin enough to hear the neighbors argue about whose turn it was to buy milk. The furniture was laminated wood veneer. The sofa was foam cushioned, probably orange, possibly brown. There was a glass-fronted display cabinet holding crystal glasses that were never used, and a coffee table that anchored the room like a small altar to respectability. This was the happiest barracks of the Eastern Bloc. That was the phrase Hungarians used for their own country. It said everything about the pride and the tragedy both at once. This is the story of an ordinary Tuesday inside those barracks. The radio came on almost immediately. In most households, it was already part of the architecture of the morning. Kossuth Radio, the main state station, broadcasting on AM. Named after Lajos Kossuth in 1949, it was the regime's voice dressed up as a national institution. The morning news, the Reggeli Kronika, began, as it always began, with industrial production figures. A tractor factory in Győr had exceeded its quarterly quota. A fraternal delegation from Bulgaria had arrived to study Hungarian agricultural methods. The weather forecast came next, one of the few broadcasts that was genuinely neutral. Some households tuned to Petofi Radio instead, the second channel, which played pop music and was considered slightly less dreary. This was not a political act, it was a generational preference. The more adventurous household, one with a shortwave radio, might have been capable of receiving Radio-Free Europe from Munich. But at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, with children to dress and a factory shift starting at 8, that was a luxury saved for the evening. Breakfast was functional: white bread, butter or margarine, tea or cocoa for the children, and, if the household could get it, real coffee. The bread cost 3 forints and 60 fillers per kilogram. That price had not changed since 1960, and it would not change until July 1979, when it jumped 50% overnight, an event millions of Hungarians remember as a genuine shock. In the early 70s, this frozen price was a point of official pride, proof that socialism delivered stability. In reality, the state was subsidizing every loaf at a loss. Good coffee, Volody Kave, was another matter entirely. It was scarce and expensive. Most households made do with frank, a chicory-based substitute, or heavily diluted instant blends. The real thing, Omnia brand, Hungarian roasted, was available in limited quantities. The finest Arabica was reserved for party officials, or for those who had access to the hard currency stores. The children were dressed in the kekköpeni, the blue school smock, mandatory since 1973. It served 2 purposes. It protected clothing and it erased visible class differences. The factory worker's child and the party official's child wore identical garments, in theory. Younger children wore the kisdobo scarf, the red necktie of the young drummers. Older ones, between 10 and 14, wore the utoro neckerchief, red with a white stripe, the pioneers. Not wearing it on a ceremonial day invited attention from the teacher. Every child in Hungary studied from the same nationally standardized textbooks, the same maths book, the same literature anthology. There was no curriculum diversity. There was no choice. There was, however, the legendary 4-color ballpoint pen, a coveted item that sometimes had to be sourced through personal connections or queued for at the stationers. Hungary in the 1970s was a manufacturing society. The great socialist factories, Chapel Iron and Metalworks, Icarus buses, Tungsram light bulbs, Gans railway stock were not merely workplaces. They were ideological institutions. Production quotas were set centrally. Workers quickly learned that consistently exceeding a quota meant the quota would be raised, so a kind of collective restraint emerged. You worked just above the line, not too fast, not too slow. Enough to earn the bonus, not so much that the bonus became the new minimum. The factories maintained what economists would later call unemployment behind the gates. Firms were forbidden from laying off workers, so surplus labor sat inside the factory pretending to work, while the factory pretended to employ them. This maintained the fiction of full employment, a core commitment of the system, while producing goods that Eastern Bloc partner countries were obligated to buy regardless of quality. There was a phrase everyone knew: they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. It required no explanation. But the real economy, the one that actually kept households running, happened after hours. They called it Fusizás. A plumber working his state shift from 8 to 4 would spend his evenings on private jobs, paid in cash at several times his official rate. A doctor at a state hospital expected halepens, gratitude money, for special attention. A skilled craftsman kept a network of private clients while maintaining his official employment purely for the pension, the insurance, and the political cover. This second economy became so significant that by the mid-70s, economists estimated it accounted for a substantial share of actual household income. The state knew about it. The state tolerated it. The state relied on it. The factory canteen, the Uzemi Konya, was one of the genuine achievements of the system, and one that workers remember with a mixture of affection and horror. There were two options, the A menu and the B menu. Soup and a main course, occasionally a dessert. The food was heavily subsidized. A full lunch cost 4 to 8 forints. The dishes were the classics: goulash soup, purkult with egg dumplings, breaded fried pork cutlet, the undefeated Hungarian favorite, and the polarizing green bean stew, which divided the workforce as reliably as any political question. After work, before going home, came shopping. This was not a leisure activity. It was logistics. The daily shop was the Kozert, the neighborhood state grocer: bread, milk, eggs, sugar, flour. You queued at the counter. The shop assistant, almost always a woman, wielded disproportionate power. She controlled what came from under the counter, what was reserved for regular customers, what extras were available for a smile or a small envelope of cash. The planned economy produced permanent mismatches between supply and demand. Prices were fixed, often below what it cost to produce the goods, and that created chronic shortages. When a delivery of something scarce arrived, the word spread. The queue formed within minutes. Queuing had strict unwritten rules. You could hold a place for a family member. Cutting the queue was a social crime, and if you did not know what people were queuing for, you joined anyway. It was probably worth having. The banana was perhaps the most telling example. Bananas arrived from Ecuador and Colombia via Hamburg, transported by refrigerated truck, a 35-day journey. Each customer was limited to 1 kilogram. Word of a banana delivery spread through a neighborhood like news of an emergency. People queued for things they could not yet see, trusting that the queue itself was proof of worthwhileness. Party functionaries, meanwhile, had their allocation delivered to their homes by taxi. And then there were the inter-tourist shops, a parallel universe. Here for West German marks, US dollars, or British pounds, obtainable only by those who had traveled abroad or received money from relatives in the West. You could buy genuine Western jeans, imported cosmetics, quality coffee, electronics, things that did not exist in the ordinary shops. A pair of genuine Western jeans cost up to 1,500 forints at Budapest's Exeri flea market, roughly half a month's salary for a factory worker and the price of a new bicycle. But jeans were not merely clothing. They represented the West, freedom, modernity, and a quiet refusal to dress like everyone else. Magyar Televízió operated one channel, The television, usually a Soviet Rubin, a Hungarian Orion, or a Czech Tesla, was the focal point of every living room. The most beloved program was Delta, a science magazine launched in 1964. It covered Western scientific achievements, making it one of the few genuinely informative windows onto the non-socialist world. Het, the Sunday evening current affairs show, sometimes pushed to the boundaries of what could be said. French comedies, especially Louis de Funès, were enormously popular. Soviet war epics and children's animations filled the rest. Hungary, by Eastern Bloc standards, had relatively more access to Western film than Poland or Romania. This was part of the deal. The happiest barracks had slightly better entertainment. Dinner was the most elaborate meal of the day, cooked from scratch, almost always by the wife, regardless of whether she had worked a full shift. Goulash soup, the universal Tuesday evening solution. Perkult with egg dumplings, breaded pork with fried potatoes, sour cream on everything. In a two-room apartment, the kitchen was often the only room with guaranteed privacy from the children. Family arguments, important conversations, and the occasional politically hazardous remark about the news, they all happened over the kitchen table. After dinner, the geography of the evening divided along gendered lines. The men went to the koksma, the traditional pub, palinka, cheap wine, hard-boiled eggs in a jar, and an unspoken understanding that this was where the working day ended properly. There was also the Sorozo, the beer hall, draft dreyer or kobanyai lager, largely male, loud, and the prestzo, the espresso bar, slightly more aspirational, where women might also appear. Tuesday evening drinking was not the exception. It was the norm, partly social escape from the cramped apartment, partly genuine camaraderie, and partly a form of compressed protest, the place where the jokes were told that could not be told at work. To buy a car, you visited Merkur, the state car dealer, and paid a deposit. Then you waited. A Trabant cost 62,000 forints. The average monthly wage was about 3,000. That is 20 months' salary, and then you waited 4 to 6 more years for delivery. You might not get the color you ordered. The car was not merely transport. In a society where housing, jobs, and consumer goods were allocated by the state, the car was one of the few things you could own outright and move freely with. It was the symbol of achieved stability. You maintained it, you repaired it, you never took it for granted. A telephone was even harder. Waiting times of 10 to 15 years were documented. In rural areas, 200 people shared a single telephone. In Debrecen, Hungary's second largest city, 12,000 people sat on the waiting list for a connection. The practical solution was to walk to the neighbor who had one, or use the public telephone box if it was working. Hungary had 2 passports. The red passport allowed travel within the socialist bloc, the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, relatively easy to obtain. The blue passport was for the West, Austria, Italy, France. To get one, you needed your employer's written recommendation that you were politically trustworthy. Your boss had veto power over your holiday plans. Yugoslavia was the privileged exception. Accessible, quasi-Western in feel, where Hungarians could buy jeans and Italian goods and swim in the Adriatic. The 1970s were not the 1950s. The secret police, the AVH, had been reorganized into the BM3/3, the Interior Ministry's internal counterintelligence department. The methods were subtler. No more show trials, no more midnight deportations. Instead, informants, an extensive network of civilians reporting on their colleagues, their neighbors, their family members. The apartment building's caretaker was notoriously suspected, but the practical psychology of the era was not terror, it was self-censorship. Most Hungarians had internalized with extraordinary sophistication exactly where the lines were. You could joke about shortages, you could grumble about bureaucracy, you could even criticize inefficiency. What you could not touch was the system itself, the party leadership, and the Soviet alliance. Political jokes were the most sophisticated response to this condition. Under Rákosi in the 50s, they called them the 5+2 jokes. 5 years in prison for the teller, 2 years for the listener. Under Kádár in the 70s, there was no prison, but you might miss a bonus, lose a promotion, attract quiet attention. There is a joke from this era. 3 men are talking on the tram. One says, "Kádár is an idiot." A plainclothes policeman arrests him. At the station, the officer asks, "Which Kádár did you mean?" The man says, "The one on our street, of course." The officer releases him, then calls him back. "Wait, which Kádár on which street?" The joke acknowledged that everyone knew everything, that the system was absurd, and that the acknowledgement itself had to remain private. This was the deepest characteristic of life under Kádár, not oppression, ambivalence. Hungarians knew they were in a prison, but it was, by Eastern Bloc standards, a reasonably well-furnished cell, and the guards had stopped torturing people, so most people made the deal. In public, loyal, non-confrontational, attending the mandatory meetings, raising the mandatory hand in the mandatory vote. In private, skeptical, ironic, informed, often through Radio Free Europe, and fully aware of the gap between official truth and experienced reality. The sociologist ElevenLabs called it the proletarian renaissance, a genuine flourishing of private life, private culture, and private values in the spaces the regime could not reach. The alarm clock that woke our family this morning will ring again tomorrow. The bread will still cost $3.60. The queue at the Közert will form again. The factory will pretend to need all its workers, and the workers will pretend to produce. And in the evening, in the kitchen, over a bowl of goulash, someone will tell a joke that cannot be told at work. That was the deal. That was the happiest barracks. And for millions of Hungarians, that was an ordinary Tuesday. If this is your first time here, this channel tells the stories of everyday life behind the Iron Curtain. The strange, the tragic, the surprisingly human. Subscribe, because next week we are going inside Rexk, Hungary's secret forced labor camp, the place the world was never meant to know about.